So get this, 4 trains got hit at gunpoint in just over a year by the notorious Dalton gang. These guys were making a name for themselves, no doubt about it. But then the Dalton brothers and their crew decided to go absolutely crazy with their next move. 5 bandits rolled into Coffeyville, tied up their horses, grabbed their rifles, and headed straight across the street where C.M. Condon Bank sat right across from the First National Bank. Their plan? Hit both banks at the exact same time. But here's the thing. Somebody recognized these boys on their way into town. So while they're inside sticking up the bankers trying to get them to crack open the safes, the townspeople outside are coming out with guns blazing. The thieves got pinned down real quick. 2 of them managed to bust out of First National with a bag holding 20 grand in paper money and gold. Then the others ducked out from Condon. The bandits shot a few townspeople, but when they tried making their escape into the alley, all 5 of them went down in a hail of bullets. Only one guy survived, Emmett Dalton, who was absolutely riddled with bullets and got dragged off by the law. And that's how the story went. That was supposedly the end of the Dalton gang. But hold up, they hadn't been terrorizing this part of the West with just 5 people. There was still another Dalton brother out there, Bill, plus a whole bunch of associates, bootleggers, bandits, and straight-up killers, still running around free. Out in the Old West, men could just disappear like ghosts. And when an outlaw's trail went cold, lawmen would get desperate and turn to people who weren't tied down by duty or procedure. Gunslingers who were in it for the reward money. Bounty hunters. Frank Canton was living right in gang territory. The dude was both undersheriff of Pawnee County in Oklahoma Territory and a deputy US Marshal. So he kept close tabs on what the Dalton gang was up to. Now, Canton wasn't exactly a Boy Scout himself. People were whispering about how much he loved his booze and had a thing for being brutal. He'd spent some time out west working as a cowboy and a sheriff. Nobody really knew much about his past before that. But right now, Canton had a badge and a job to handle. From what he could tell, after that massacre at Coffeyville, the Dalton gang had gotten back together under the leadership of this guy, Bill Doolin, and the last free Dalton brother. In '93, the gang straight up murdered 3 deputy U.S. Marshals who tried to ambush them. Later on, they hit a bank in Pawnee and snatched up the cashier for a bit. Things got so bad that commissioners were begging the governor to bring in martial law. But nobody listened. Finally, officers gunned down the last outlawed Dalton brother in June of '94. And folks were saying, the country can now draw a sigh of relief for the terror of the West is no more. The rest of the gang will be caught. But Canton wasn't celebrating just yet. Under Bill Doolin's leadership, the Doolin gang, or the Wild Bunch as they were called, had some seriously dangerous desperados, including cockeyed Charlie Pierce, George Bittercreek Newcomb, and Charles Dynamite Dick Clifton. Every crime they pulled made the price on their heads go up, and Canton wrote about how back then there was anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 offered for the body of each member of the Wild Bunch, dead or alive. Of course, there were always smaller crimes to chase down too. Canton went after a few guys who'd been stealing cattle and selling the meat at a butcher shop. One of them was this guy Bill, or B. Dunn, who led the Dunn brothers, a crew that Canton saw as bloodthirsty thieves who were buddies with the Wild Bunch. Here was Canton's shot to throw an enemy behind bars, but he came to him with a deal. The Dunn brothers would help Canton take down the Wild Bunch. In exchange, the law would drop the cattle rustling case, and after covering what it cost to run the missions, the rewards for catching the outlaws would get paid to the Dunn brothers. Basically, the Dunns would become bounty hunters. Canton said yes to the deal. Most of the time, reward money got collected by lawmen. Over in Indian Territory nearby, there was this deputy U.S. Marshal named Bass Reeves who'd been born into slavery and was now collecting thousands of dollars chasing down murderers, bootleggers, and other outlaws. But regular citizens could collect rewards too. These irregular guys going after fugitives only got called bounty hunters much later on. They weren't just drifters picking up wanted posters as a job. Bounty hunters were usually private detectives or, like the Dunn brothers, people who knew the wanted guys and decided to turn on them for cash. The Dunn brothers and Frank Canton couldn't stand each other, but Canton needed a way to get to the Wild Bunch. He knew that outlaws could turn into complete ghosts out on the frontier. They could use fake names, run off to places nobody knew about, or lay low in forgotten towns way out in the middle of nowhere. The U.S. had been pushing across the continent in waves and fits and starts. The government grabbed land by buying it, taking it over, and removing people, and folks rushed out west. But by the mid-1800s, there were still distinct and independent indigenous nations ruling over the big middle chunk of the country. When settlers trespassed onto treaty land looking for property and minerals, they clashed with stressed-out indigenous groups. And on top of that, ecological devastation gave U.S. officials an excuse to pressure friendly chiefs and members into signing away land on behalf of entire indigenous nations and go to war with the ones who wouldn't leave their homelands. Disease, starvation, and fighting absolutely destroyed the indigenous population of the United States. It went from maybe several million before contact down to only 250,000 by the late 1800s, compared to something like 75 million non-indigenous people. Whether it was tough bands of Comanche and Lakota, or allies to the U.S. like the Nez Perce and Osage, they all got forced onto small and usually run-down reservations. This whole long process of displacement created, by the 1890s, a rough edge of U.S. settlement called Oklahoma Territory, patrolled by lawmen like Frank Canton, but crawling with outlaws. Even though the area had been set aside for removed peoples, the Dawes Act of 1887 took away the rights of indigenous nations to even their own reservations, splitting up land between individual native households and opening up the rest for settlement. In these land rushes, settlers scrambled onto these lands. They staked claims and fought over who owned what on paper. Like everywhere else on the frontier, tents and wagons turned into creaky towns, stores, and saloons. Owning and working a frontier homestead had been a dream that came true not just for male citizens, but also for immigrants, women, and formerly enslaved people. But law enforcement was usually pretty useless. On top of the troublemakers and bandit gangs who lived on the frontier, the American West had one of the most heavily armed populations in the world. A culture where you handled insults with violence and looked down on cowards often showed itself in random drunken shootouts. But things were changing. Busy towns got strung up with wire. The shine of steel, the sound of the railroad, and the black spray of oil meant new fortunes. It would become in the age of big shots like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Edison. More and more trains were crossing the West. Businessmen brought in manufacturing, and huge monopolistic cattle companies were pushing out local cowboys. Settlers' dreams of a self-sufficient life on a big homestead were dying. And so the desperados who robbed banks, messed with the railroads, and rustled cattle from the invading corporate powers became popular figures of resistance. Bill Doolin was really good at winning over the public. He'd give grocery money to poor settlers and make friends with townspeople, who'd then tip him off when the law was getting close. But the wild bunch weren't riding around doing charity work. In early 1895, the gang crossed onto reservation land to steal horses from the Creek or Muskogee Nation. Indigenous residents chased the gang in a running gunfight, and the bandits scattered. The Dunn boys tipped off Frank Canton, and he rode to the scene. But the bandits were long gone, hiding somewhere. Always suspicious, Canton told the Dunn boys that he and the sheriff were going to camp out in the woods behind the Dunn place for a while. He figured at least some of the wild bunch would show up. Bitter Creek. Newcomb had left money with the Dunn boys, and word was he was seeing the Dunn's teenage sister, Rose. A whole week went by without any sign of the wild bunch, but the Dunns told Canton that 80 miles west the gang had stuck up a train. The thieves got away, except for Tulsa Jack, who got tracked down and shot by deputy US Marshals. The most feared deputy U.S. Marshals working these parts would become legends of the Wild West, known as the Three Guardsmen: Heck Thomas, Bill Tillman, and Chris Madsen. These guys were like wolves who tracked day and night, capturing or shooting hundreds of famous outlaws. Frank Canton was jealous of how successful the Three Guardsmen were. With barely anything to show for his partnership with the Dunn boys, he packed up his stakeout camp in late April. About a week later, Wild Bunch gang members Bitter Creek, Newcomb, and cockeyed Charlie Pierce showed up at the Dunn place. From the confusing accounts of that night, what we can figure out is that the Outlaws never saw the sun come up. The Dunn brothers shot their friends, threw their dead bodies onto a wagon, covered them with a tarp, and headed to the capital of Guthrie to show their cargo to Marshal Nix. Nix had approved the Dunn's ambush plan earlier and sent Guardsman Heck Thomas and Bill Tillman to keep an eye on things from a distance. The newspapers ran a story about how this deputy named Sam Schaefer and his posse killed the Outlaws, But Schaefer was just a fake name used by one of the Dunn brothers to hide who they really were. With Pierce and Newcomb dead, the Wild Bunch had no clue the Dunns had betrayed them. Canton showed up in Guthrie, feeling like he'd been cheated out of his chance to catch the Outlaws, and he noticed something weird about the bodies. The Dunns had said they waited for the Outlaws to arrive and shot them when they fought back, but Ken saw that the wounds looked like the victims had been lying down, maybe executed in their sleep. While dead or alive, bounties promised you'd get paid even if you brought the wanted guy in dead. That didn't give you permission to just kill people. Shooting an unarmed or non-threatening fugitive could still be murder. But in reality, authorities usually welcomed it when criminals died, and they'd accept sketchy explanations for using lethal force. The Dunn brothers' stories that didn't match up went unchallenged. Judges and lawmen didn't pretend to be the only people in the justice business. Folks who said they were upholding the law often did it without a badge. The private Pinkerton Detective Agency infiltrated gangs and had landed big contracts from the government. And bounties on outlaws' heads were often really profitable because the pot had been sweetened by big companies that wanted to bring down the men who were threatening their shipping and supplies. Back in '81, the famous lawman Wyatt Earp sent a telegram asking if the reward for a group of bandits would still count if they were brought in dead. He got confirmation it would. Earp hadn't contacted his official boss, but rather the people offering the bounty. The express and banking company, Wells Fargo. Just a few years back, Frank Canton himself had been a hired gun for a monopolistic cattle association in Wyoming, which carried out illegal assassinations and executions of local competitors and homesteaders they accused of cattle rustling. Canton was suspected of being involved in at least one murder during the so-called Johnson County War, but corrupt officials blocked attempts to prosecute the cattle barons and their vigilantes. Canton had made a great mercenary. One cowboy remembered, "Frank was the fastest gunman I ever knew." Life with a badge hadn't been glamorous at all. If reward for wanted men were an incentive for lawmen and bounty-hunting civilians, they also created rivalry between them. The Dunn brothers pocketed the reward money for Pierce and Newcomb without even paying Canton back for his personal expenses. Canton hit back by arresting B. Dunn for helping outlaws. The charges got dismissed because the Dunns had gained powerful friends. They joined the posse of the Guardsmen Thomas and Tillman, going after the bounties on the rest of the Wild Bunch. Canton settled for drinking in saloons at night and doing deputy marshal work during the day. That summer he arrested 2 young girls who some people said had run with the Wild Bunch, the gun-carrying 15 and 16-year-olds Cattle Annie and Jenny Little Britches Stevens. Both got sent to Massachusetts, the younger one to reform school, the older one to prison. Meanwhile, other lawmen were going after bigger names. Tillman arrested Little Bill Radler in September and single-handedly arrested Bill Doolin in early 1896. Officers shot Red Buck Waitman in March, and a few months later, Texas marshals grabbed Dynamite Dick Clifton and threw him in jail with Doolin. But within 2 weeks, Clifton and Doolin broke out. The feared gang leader was running free again. The line between law and anarchy had gotten blurry out west, like kicked-up trail dust. Years ago, the infamous Dalton brothers had been deputy marshals just like him. Canton's huge secret was that he followed the same path, but in the opposite direction. His date of birth and where he came from were lies. So was his name. Frank Canton never existed, because Frank Canton was just the alias of escaped outlaw Joe Horner. Years after his escape, he secretly got a pardon from the Texas governor, and so he stayed a lawman whose job was bringing killers and thieves to justice, himself a killer and a thief who'd escaped justice.